There was no official seal, no briefing book, just a page handwritten in blue ink, addressed to him not as a position, but as a person. John. He read it once, then again, then a third time. And when his eyes returned to the final paragraph, they lingered, not because of its prose, but because of the truth. It no longer asked politely to be acknowledged. Precedent, when surrendered, no longer guards the gate. It opens it. He looked up. Are there any pending Article 2 reviews? He asked. None at this time, his aide replied. Then open one. Immediate review. Presidential authority, termination scope. Label it institutional defense. Outside the chamber, in the marble corridors that echo both history and delay, two junior clerks walked silently past each other before one spoke. They removed them before we ruled. No, the other said, they removed them because they understood we wouldn't. Newsrooms rendered the moment with blunt headlines. Fox News, President redefines control. MSNBC, independent agencies erased. But in classrooms and courtrooms, at labor halls and legal symposia, in homes still clinging to a civic curriculum decades out of print, the real headline emerged. Spoken not in broadcast, but in breath. When a president can erase the architecture of oversight with a message, a nation no longer governs. It obeys. Roberts issued no press statement. He gave no interview. But in the quiet of his chambers, beneath the faded inscription of Marbury versus Madison, he opened a worn leather-bound notebook and inscribed one sentence across the first empty page. We are no longer anticipating constitutional collapse. We are chronicling it. The memorandum from the Fed arrived like a siren that refused to scream. Factual in tone, surgical in timing, and devastating in implication. Delivered under executive-level encryption at 7:11 a.m. Its core warning sat quietly between paragraphs of restrained financial language. Language designed not to incite, but to inform those still capable of understanding that the foundations beneath them were already shifting. An abrupt and unexplained change in Federal Reserve leadership, absent a Senate process or institutional buffer, is projected to result in a 12 to 15% contraction in domestic equity markets within 48 hours of public disclosure. The sentence, devoid of adjectives, pierced more deeply than any shouted headline precisely because it spoke in the dialect of systems, numbers, time, and irreversible consequence. In the Roosevelt Room, where history once unfolded in cautious negotiations and now functioned as a theater of assertion, Trump leaned forward with the kind of stillness that always preceded his most reckless decisions. Shoulders firm, breath measured, eyes narrowed, not with doubt, but with calculation wrapped in confidence. If Jerome Powell thinks he runs the economy, he said, voice unhurried, syllables landing like coins on marble. Then it's time he remembers who signs the checks, who made the seat he's warming something worth coveting in the first place. No one interrupted. Not yet. He reached for the glass of Diet Coke that had sat untouched beside a red folder marked Feed, Succession Draft, and tapped the rim twice before continuing. Eric understands alignment. Eric doesn't ask how deep the water is when he's been told to swim. A Treasury Undersecretary finally broke the silence, his tone carefully flattened to avoid offense while still suggesting relevance. Mr. President, the Federal Reserve Chair is confirmed by the Senate for a statutory term and insulated intentionally from political manipulation to preserve economic stability. Any deviation may send a signal of Trump raised a hand, not to silence, but to declare ownership of the moment. There is no deviation, he said. There is a correction, and when a body resists correction, it's the scalpel that restores order, not the clipboard. Meanwhile, beneath the domed ceiling of One First Street, where silence often disguised the weight of constitutional reckoning, a rare, closed-door meeting of the justices was already underway. The collapse did not begin with a televised decision or a shouted debate on the Senate floor. It did not announce itself with the usual fanfare of legal conflict, nor with the careful pacing of judicial review. It arrived instead as an electronic whisper, stripped of nuance, precision-guided in intent, and delivered with the mechanical efficiency of a system that no longer felt the need to mask its ambition behind process. At 6:42 a.m., a directive pulsed through the encrypted executive channel, bypassing departments, legal counsels, and even the illusion of consultation. Its content required no elaboration because it sought no consensus. It simply declared, "Fire Wilcox, fire Harris, the Fed's next." No justification, no clause of authority, no accompanying memorandum to temper the brutality of its simplicity. In 5 words, the architecture of independence was not debated, but dismantled one instruction at a time. Gwen Wilcox, a Senate-confirmed labor attorney whose career had been built on the meticulous scaffolding of collective bargaining law, stood at the entrance of her own building, facing a scanner that no longer recognized her as part of the institution she once served. When the light turned red once, twice, with a kind of clinical finality, she did not protest, but turned to the guard, whose voice carried the familiar tension of someone tasked with the enforcement of a decision they neither authored nor understood. "Your credentials have been revoked, ma'am," he said, eyes focused on the scanner, as if it might deliver him from the shame of speaking those words. "And who issued that order?" she asked, already knowing the answer, because the question had become rhetorical in a nation where authority now arrived without a return address. Executive office logged at 6:43. Her breath slowed, not in defeat, but in clarity. "Then the rule of law has already been replaced," she said, "and we are standing in the shadow of what used to be accountability." Across the river, Kathy Harris stood in her office, watching the horizon blur behind the glass as a voicemail played on speaker. The voice was artificial, cut off at both ends, surgically efficient. "You're done." There was no signature, no callback number, and no explanation. Because explanation requires the existence of a framework in which actions remain accountable to something other than the will that enacts them. Harris didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned to her assistant, who stood paralyzed in the doorway. "That wasn't a firing," she said. "That was a deletion." At 8:02 a.m., the president posted on Truth Social, not to defend, not to contextualize, but to celebrate, as one might after tearing down the last support beam of a structure that had once resisted total consolidation of power. "Deadweight gone, Fed next." Swamp isn't just draining, it's collapsing. Within minutes, the phrase "clean house" topped the trending list across the political internet. Not because it was clever, but because it was clear. The message wasn't coded. It was conquest. And the celebration didn't come from the margins. It came from the core. Justice Elena Kagan read the leaked directive not once, but 3 times. The last time aloud, as if to confirm that each word still existed on the page, not as rumor, but as a wound. She stood by the window, eyes on the marble steps below, her clerk behind her, holding the printed email like a subpoena sent from a crumbling system to its conscience. "They executed this without deliberation," he said, "without process, without even the courtesy of a fabricated rationale." She replied without turning. "Because they're no longer seeking legitimacy. They're seeking velocity. And unless we intervene, unless the court reasserts the boundaries they've chosen to erase, law becomes a museum artifact of restraint, not a living architecture of protection." Then she moved to her desk, removed her glasses, and picked up a pen she had once used to dissent on matters of war powers. This time the war was internal, and the casualties had no faces, only roles erased in silence. At 9:17, the letter reached Chief Justice John Roberts. No clerks, no transcripts, only words exchanged among those charged with interpreting the pulse of power when it begins rewriting the terms of its own restraint. Justice Alito, always precise, delivered his view with the tone of someone already drafting a majority opinion in the quiet of his mind. The executive possesses constitutional discretion over appointments, including those enshrined in statutory terms. The notion that independence extends beyond the will of the electorate misreads both history and authority. Thomas nodded once, speaking slowly, as if to emphasize that what he was offering was not opinion, but clarification. When the electorate chooses force, the judiciary owes them interpretation that does not dilute its essence. Kagan stood then, not abruptly, but with the kind of deliberate timing that ensures every word has a place to fall. And when the executive replaces policy with dynasty, she said, each syllable carrying the bite of warning rather than theatrics. What we are interpreting is not governance. It's succession. Alito answered swiftly. Succession implies heredity. This implies loyalty. Sotomayor, who had said nothing until now, leaned forward, placing both palms flat against the mahogany table. Loyalty to what? To constitutional order, or to the man who erodes it while daring us to blink first? Justice Gorsuch, never fond of spectacle but eager to anchor argument in structural reasoning, opened the Fed's institutional charter and pointed to a highlighted clause. The Federal Reserve by statute is an autonomous agency with quasi-private character. That status does not warrant constitutional protection from reorganization. Kagan didn't hesitate. Slavery also existed by statute in 1850. That didn't make it moral nor eternal. Technical legitimacy never immunized systemic abuse. It only delayed reckoning. Her words, delivered without raised voice, lingered like a verdict already etched in stone. Across the hallway, Chief Justice Roberts sat in his office. The door closed. The lights dimmed, not by design but by habit. Before him lay the full text of Humphrey's executor, annotated by his own hand years earlier, during a time when such precedents felt like anchors rather than artifacts. His finger paused on a line he had once circled twice. The independence of executive agencies cannot exist merely at the whim of those who seek to harness them. He closed the file, but left the pen uncapped. At the Fed, 6 failed intrusion attempts had been recorded from Treasury-linked IPs before a 7th log success. A draft populated the succession field in the secure system. Acting Chair Eric Trump. The timestamp blinked. The system hesitated. So did the markets. Back in chambers, Kagan turned to her clerk and spoke without bitterness, only clarity. If this court ratifies the absorption of monetary independence into the bloodstream of dynastic will, she said, then we haven't merely failed to guard the institution. We've baptized its hijacking as constitutional. The clerk swallowed hard. Would you like that phrase differently for internal memo purposes? Kagan didn't blink. Don't water it down. Print it, file it, and write a line beneath. The last time we hesitated, Korematsu became law. The ruling arrived not as a gavel strike, but as a whisper in ink, and signed, unexplained, unclaimed. 2 pages. No dissent, no signature, beyond the haunting per curiam, and yet it carried the full force of law. The President holds the constitutional authority to remove principal officers of the United States at will, without cause or explanation, irrespective of statutory limitations. The sentence struck not like thunder, but like erosion, slow, deliberate, irreversible. In her chambers, Justice Elena Kagan stared at the printout as if it had been delivered from a different court entirely, one that operated not in the light of precedent, but in the shadow of fear. They issued it as if law were a suggestion, she said flatly, handing the decision to her clerk. 2 pages. No argument. No vote count. Just a signature that means don't ask who wrote it. Just comply. The clerk read silently, then looked up. Should we request an internal memo on how the majority assembled? Kagan shook her head. We don't need a memo. We need a mirror. Across the hallway, Chief Justice Roberts stood alone in his office, the ruling still warm on his desk, not yet entered into the docket when he received it, though his name now sat beneath it in implied consent. He scanned the margins. No initials, no clerk's note, no record of deliberation, just law, born without labor. A soft voice broke the silence. You didn't sign it. Roberts turned to see a senior advisor, one he had trusted through 1,000 procedural storms. I wasn't even briefed, Roberts replied. That was the point. His face tightened. Who? The advisor hesitated. They all did, John, because they're not convinced. They're afraid. Afraid of the ruling? No, afraid of him. At the White House, Trump stood beneath a portrait of Andrew Jackson, index finger tapping the resolute desk like a metronome set to constitutional collapse. CFPB, he said. Gone. Mnuchin, standing by the fireplace, tried reason. Sir, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau reports directly to Congress. There's a statutory firewall. Firewalls burn, Trump said, smiling without humor. We've got precedent now. Per curiam, baby. That's Latin for get out of my way. He turned to an aide. EPA's next. I'm tired of scientists stalling permits while they play with frogs. And CDC, I want my cousin Bobby in there. He's read a book on viruses. The room didn't laugh, but no one left either. Back in chambers, Kagan sat with Sotomayor. The silence between them deeper than dissent. The door closed. No notes. So that's how it ends, Sotomayor said. No signatures, no votes, just 2 pages and 1 man behind the curtain. Kagan didn't blink. It doesn't end. It curdles. Sotomayor raised an eyebrow. Elena, we've written dissents before. We've written warnings. What do we write now? Kagan folded the decision. We write an obituary. Later that afternoon, in the hallway outside the court, a reporter caught Roberts between meetings. Chief Justice, did you approve today's ruling? Roberts paused. My name is on it. Did you write it? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the marble pillars above him. Monuments to deliberation now repurposed to mass retreat. That night at a private dinner, a retired judge leaned toward Roberts and spoke with a voice weathered by precedent. Per curiam was never meant for this. Roberts swirled his glass. It wasn't meant for fear either. In the markets, bond yields jittered. At the Fed, algorithms flagged unscheduled succession risk. At the EPA, staff received internal guidance. Expect leadership changes. No comment at this time. And in her private notebook, Kagan wrote a single line beneath the ruling's title. They didn't break the court. They hollowed it from the inside out. No official record announced the meeting. No press release confirmed its occurrence. Even the nameplate outside SCOTUS Interrogation Room 3 had been removed, replaced with a single yellow card that read reserved. Inside, the air didn't move. 9 justices sat along the east wall, robes folded over laps like ceremonial armor turned inward. At the head of the room sat Chief Justice John Roberts, posture rigid, face unreadable. Across from them, seated without privilege or pretense, was Donald J. Trump. Between them, a table, a clock, and a witness. Roberts opened without welcome. This proceeding is not a hearing. It carries no precedent. It exists because the court has not spoken, yet consequences have. Trump smiled slowly, as if he'd already won something no one else understood. I don't need a precedent, he said. I bring one with me. It's called Article 2. Justice Kagan crossed one leg over the other, pin balanced across her fingers. Article 2 doesn't crown you. It tasks you. Trump chuckled. It gives me the whole executive branch. It gives you responsibilities. You turn them into threats. Trump leaned forward, elbow spread. I am the executive. The Constitution says I run this show. No, Kagan replied, tone colder than marble. It says you serve, not that you own. Justice Gorsuch spoke next, voice calm but pointed. The framers never intended for elected leadership to be smothered by unelected bureaucrats. Harry Litman shifted in his seat, clearing his throat with theatrical precision. That's exactly what they intended, Justice Gorsuch. They built guardrails because they'd already seen what unchecked power looked like. Gorsuch didn't turn, but the twitch in his pen said enough. Justice Alito joined in, arms folded. Mr. Litman, no clause in the Constitution expressly protects agency heads from removal. Your interpretation is aspirational, not textual. Litman raised an eyebrow. Neither does it grant the president authority to run the government like a family firm. That's not constitutionalism. That's nepotism in formal wear. Trump grinned wider. Call it what you want. I call it loyalty. Justice Sotomayor's voice, when it emerged, carried the exhaustion of a woman still burning through the last fire of principle. You fired the chair of the CFPB without reason. Then you pushed to replace the EPA administrator with a campaign donor and the CDC director with your cousin. Trump shrugged. They trust me. That's worth more than credentials. You replace structure with instinct. Instinct wins elections. Elections don't repeal accountability. Roberts leaned forward now, eyes on Trump. Mr. President, did you know the court's last ruling, the per curiam, was entered without my review? Trump met his gaze unblinking. I assumed the court was unified. You assumed wrong. Justice Barrett spoke, voice softer but no less edged. Even unity cannot excuse abandonment of process. Trump waved a hand dismissively. Process is for people who can't move fast enough, Kagan interjected. Injustice is for people who remember why we slowed down in the first place. Lippman tapped his notes. Every time power concentrates, it does so by calling institutions slow, inefficient, outdated. That's how autocracies get dressed up as reform. Trump rolled his eyes. You all think too small. I think legacy, he answered. And history thinks in consequences. The room stilled. Even the walls seemed to withhold breath. Justice Roberts spoke again, more to the institution than to the man. This court stands not to defend power, but to define its boundaries. Trump stood, then draw them, and let the voters decide who crosses them. He exited without permission. No one followed. Kagan remained seated, her pen still resting across her fingers. She turned to Roberts. You called this meeting, she said. Now the docket's waiting. He nodded once. Then let's write something. History doesn't have to redact. The table in interrogation room 3, already heavy with the weight of unspoken consequence, now bore the full density of ideology descending into impulse. The meeting had begun as a collision of constitutional minds, but it was rapidly becoming a confession under the disguise of bravado. Trump leaned back, arms crossed, tone casual, too casual for a man discussing the dismantling of a republic. Chief, he said, eyes fixed on Roberts with a grin half-earned. You've always been scared of legacy. I'm here to make one. Roberts didn't flinch, but his fingers tapped once against the oak. A legacy built on what? On impact? On control? Kagan corrected. On movement, Trump countered. You all sit in marble and whisper about precedent while I'm out there reshaping history. Roberts stared, his voice quieter now, but sharper. What would stop you from replacing the chair of the Federal Reserve with your son-in-law? Trump didn't pause. Nothing should. The room halted for a second. Even time respected the silence. Sotomayor blinked, mouth slightly open. Gorsuch looked down. Barrett tilted her head, but said nothing. Only Kagan spoke, and even her voice, so often steeled by reason, carried the tremble of something breaking under moral pressure. Then we are not a republic. We are a brand. Trump smiled wider. That's right, a strong one. Streamlined, recognizable, global. Lippman leaned forward, elbows on the table. That isn't governance, that's franchising. Trump smirked. Franchises win, institutions stall. Roberts looked down at the memo in front of him, a draft dissent he hadn't yet shared, and pressed his palm against it like he could feel the ink bleeding. Do you hear yourself? He asked. I do, Trump said proudly. And so do my voters. They hear a man who doesn't apologize for knowing how to run things. Gorsuch tried to redirect. The president's confidence in executive authority, while expansive, is not inherently unconstitutional. Kagan raised her pen without looking up. Expansive confidence doesn't violate the Constitution. Substituting bloodlines for qualifications does. Trump tapped the table again. You say bloodlines like it's an insult. I say it's commitment, trust, loyalty. You all treat experience like a holy relic. I trust the people I built empires with. Lippman exhaled hard. And when the empire collapses, Trump shrugged. We build another. That's the American way. Justice Alito folded his arms. History often reveals its authors in the margins. Trump grinned. And I'm writing in bold. Kagan turned to Roberts, voice steady again, though every syllable felt carved in ice. If we do not answer this moment, history will remember that we watched power name itself permanent and did nothing. Roberts remained still. So Soda, Mayor's voice returned. You promised to defend the court, John, not just its walls. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was surgical. Trump stood. You keep talking about law like it's a leash. I treat it like a ladder, and I've already climbed it. Kagan didn't rise. She only met his eyes and said, with something between pity and fury. You didn't climb it. You broke every rung on the way up. Roberts stood slowly, offering no excuse, no deflection, only a single sentence. "I'll need 10 minutes. No one followed. No one moved. He stepped into the adjoining chamber, a room barely used since Rehnquist's tenure, now cloaked in shadows and silence. The door clicked shut behind him like punctuation on a sentence too long delayed. On the table, a single folder waited, his own notes on Humphrey's executor versus United States, a case often cited but rarely invoked in full. He opened the file, not to skim, but to remember. One margin underlined twice in his own hand from 2 decades earlier read. The preservation of structural integrity must outweigh deference to any office. He breathed not deeply but deliberately. Beside it, tucked inside the back flap, lay a faded copy of his 2005 oath of office. "I will administer justice without respect to persons and do equal right to the poor and to the rich." He read it once, then again, and then he reached for the drawer that housed texts never meant for routine citation. He opened to Clause 28. Provisional Constraint Doctrine, Judicial Emergency Provision, permits the court under peacetime conditions to issue binding limitations on the executive when structural elements of the Constitution face imminent compromise. He circled the clause, rose, and returned. The room hadn't shifted. Trump still stood by the door, arms crossed, smirking like a man who believed history had run out of ink. Roberts sat, unfolded the printed order, and placed it in front of him. "The court will issue a provisional ruling." Trump raised an eyebrow. "Based on what?" "Clause 28, Roberts answered. "Judicial emergency provision." Trump scoffed. "Emergency? You think me exercising my powers is an emergency?" Kagan leaned forward. "When power forgets it has limits, the system remembers for it." Trump shot her a glare. "You can quote old doctrines all day. My voters didn't elect a technician. They elected a fighter. They elected a president." Roberts replied calmly. "Not a monarch." Gorsuch looked uneasy but remained silent. Alito leaned back, visibly agitated. Littman's voice steady added. "Clause 28 was designed precisely for a moment when legality begins serving the man instead of the charter." Barrett spoke softly. "This ruling will bind." "Yes," Roberts confirmed. "Effective immediately. The president may not dismiss or replace leadership of any independent agency until the court concludes formal review." Trump stepped forward. "This is a joke. You're telling me I can't touch my own administration?" "You can manage your cabinet," Roberts replied. "You may not dismantle the scaffolding that holds the roof up." Trump laughed once. "I built the damn building." Kagan didn't smile. "You painted your name on it." The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was saturated like the moment before a verdict is read or a nation exhales. Trump stood still. Then, with the same bravado that had brought him into the room, he turned toward the exit. "Enjoy your paperwork," he muttered. "I'll see you at the ballot box." He left. Kagan glanced at Roberts. Her voice, now cool but resolute, landed with finality. "You stopped the hemorrhage." Roberts looked at the order on the table. "For now," he said. "But restraint isn't a cure. It's a tourniquet. We better start writing something stronger." Trump left the room like a man exiting a game he believed he invented. He said nothing. He looked at no one, but the silence he carried out became the storm others couldn't contain. 10 minutes later, his press aide tweeted, "The court blinked, America weeps." No context, just blame. Just grievance packaged in 280 characters. On Fox News, the cheering read, "Scott saves the Fed, but can it save America?" The panel split down familiar lines, half praising judicial restraint, half warning of unelected interference. None dared say it aloud, but everyone danced around the same fire. This wasn't a legal crisis. It was a legitimacy one. In a cafe 2 blocks from the Capitol, a young attorney folded his laptop, leaned toward a colleague, and spoke the line history books rarely preserve, but always remember. They didn't stop him for moral reasons. They stopped him for the market. And that's how every empire rots. The other nodded because it rang true in the way bitter truths always do. Quietly, and with no one to quote. Back at the court, the order stood on its own. Signed, sealed, provisional. No press conference, no grand rhetoric, just words typed into the bloodstream of a republic. The president shall not exercise termination authority over any independent agency leadership during judicial review under Clause 28. Short, surgical, unforgiving. Kagan sat at her desk, pinned down, robe loosened at the collar, the chamber empty, the storm past, but not stilled. She whispered, not to anyone present, but perhaps to the oath still echoing in the marble. The rule wasn't made for the timid. And the final line, printed in digital ink beneath the ruling, shared not by the court, but by those still paying attention. Donald Trump didn't break the system. He showed us how hollow it had become.